Adriana
Thank
Watterson.
you very much. Mwah. So, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here with all of you this morning. I have a great group of panelists. For those of you who didn't attend, yesterday we actually had a little mini session, a Multicultural Media Summit, and each of my three panelists gave really great presentations, which you missed, so you won't be seeing today. But we will be sort of referring back to some of the broader conversations that we had yesterday in our panel today. And I know that what we're talking about might sound a little odd to some of you, because you know that a lot of the work that we do at Horowitz is in multicultural and Hispanic, and of course we've got Renny here. I'll introduce everybody in a second from Telemundo. So, why are we talking about breaking down silos by race and ethnicity? But you'll understand, I think, by the time we get to the end of this panel. And actually, a big part of the reason why we're having this conversation harks back to something that Evan said just a few minutes ago, which I wrote down, which is that your audiences are getting more niche, not less. And so that really is a big part of the broader context of why this multicultural, quote unquote, panel is on the main stage at Media Insights. And so without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. We do have over here my good friend Renny Diaz. Renny is the Vice President of Insights and Consumer Development at NBC Universal Telemundo Enterprises. Woohoo! We have got in the middle here Megan Elrule, and I rocked her name, right? Okay. I'm sure many of you know Megan, but she is now the head of global agency research for Twitter. Comes to us from other places, including Nielsen, I believe, right? And last but certainly not least, Joetta Gobel, who is the VP of Primary Research, Ad Sales, and Strategic Insights for A&E Networks. And I'm not going to read their bios, but as a way of sort of opening up this session, I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about, sort of segueing into this panel topic, what is your role at your company? And, what is some of the cutting edge work that you've been doing to sort of help drive some cultural insights at your respective businesses? So I'd like to start over here with Joetta.
Sure. Yeah. So my role, as you mentioned, primary research within the ad sales department, and one of my primary responsibilities is to do sort of broad scale, large theme research around topics. For instance, what I talked about yesterday around, for instance, the experience of gender and how that influences how you decode representations in advertising, or interactions with specific verticals. So sort of these broad, big picture studies that can be useful both to us and to those that our ad sales research team is reaching out to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really fantastic presentation yesterday about the role of gender and intersectionality and all these kinds of things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And Megan, talk to us a little bit about what you're doing over at Twitter.
So I lead our global agency research team. We work with the large media agencies to bring, again, these large themed, high-level projects to help advertisers understand how to leverage Twitter within their media plans and how Twitter fits in the larger media landscape. I do have a little side project around multicultural audiences. This is a very new space for Twitter. It's not something that really we have explored deeply yet, so this is a very crawl phase, if you will. So I don't know that we have a lot of cutting edge research necessarily in this space, but we did conduct a conjoint analysis to understand the preferences within a tweet that multicultural audiences prefer in terms of making them shareable. So what about a tweet makes it shareable? And so we learned that there are 7 attributes in order: topic, language, multicultural, influencer type, media, tone, as well as pieces of clickable content like your hashtags and your @mentions within your tweet. Mm-hmm. So we talked about that a little bit yesterday, but those are similar across audiences, and so we're really helping advertisers to understand how to craft tweets that make them shareable. We always get that question of virality, of how we can get content out there and get people to actually share it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Renny, I know you guys have a whole slew of different research initiatives going on, so tell us a little bit about some of the exciting stuff you're doing.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for having us, and thank you, Adriana, for inviting Telemundo and NBC Universal.
So our team is basically focused on three things. Understanding multicultural and Latino identity and how it's changing. Understanding how the technologies that our consumers are using are changing the way that they consume the stories that they love. And upping the ante on our consumer research. So figuring out new ways, and that's a little bit about what Jen Sabella and I talked about yesterday on in our session, about how we're sort of innovating new ways to do research with audiences that haven't been as reachable online and on mobile devices. And we've had to change the way that we conduct our research. Everything from the size of our surveys and the frequency with which we communicate with our consumers. So it's just changing how we test everything. And we're devoted primarily to our marketing and our content testing.
Right. Okay, so the idea of this panel, the name of the panel is really breaking down silos of race and ethnicity towards a more nuanced understanding of identity. So let's just start with this basic premise. Like, am I crazy? Like, I mean, what's wrong with the silos by race and ethnicity and perhaps gender and sort of these big categories that have been, pretty useful for all of us for a long time? What's wrong with that? Why are we even having this conversation? And we might argue that there's nothing wrong with it. So, I don't know, any opinions over here from the panel? You want to start, Megan? Sure.
I think that for Twitter specifically, we're not really looking at race and ethnicity. When you come to Twitter, when you sign up, you're signing up based on your interests and your passions. And so you're really grouped by these categories with which kind of brings you into a community and looking at people with similar interests and passions versus looking at someone by their age or their race or ethnicity or gender. You're really looking at them by the content that they're there to see and put out there in the universe. So it's less about race and ethnicity. So, I think that those silos are kind of broken down a little bit and how we need to be more focused and talking to these audiences and be more content driven versus being kind of divided by ethnicity or gender or race.
Right, so that makes me think of two things, okay? So one is absolutely that organic nature of Twitter, right? Which by definition creates these communities that are joined by other things that are not necessarily race and ethnicity, but communities of interest and passions and worldviews and all these other things. But at the same time, your analysis and the research you shared yesterday, two of the 7 things or whatever. What was the mnemonic device? You said it. Of course, it didn't work for me.
To leverage making impactful messaging tweet consistently.
Okay, so how? I wish I could have remembered that. That would have been helpful.
Mnemonic device in it.
But
Needs to
okay.
stick a little bit
You say it a couple of times, you might get it. All right. So, but 2 of those things actually have to do with culture and ethnicity and identity. So that's kind of an interesting cross section of.
So I think that culture still matters. I mean, obviously, you're reaching people through the language that they speak or how they were brought up, and I think that can resonate through the content that you're producing, but I don't think it needs to be culturally divided, or like race or ethnicity divided. I think that multicultural content can speak to everyone, and it doesn't necessarily need to just be focused on one specific audience at one time.
And didn't you show like that even among sort of white Hispanic?
So like African American content is actually the most retweeted content across all audiences, whether you're non-Hispanic white, Hispanic, Asian American, and African American. That segment is actually producing content that's more likely to be retweeted across all audiences. So I think that's just a case in point that it doesn't matter who the content is from, it's actually what's in the content that's driving people to talk about it.
Right. And so Rennie, okay, so here you've got a Spanish language Hispanic network situated within a broader media company that serves a lot of different audiences. So, what do you think about this idea of kind of starting to break down silos? Is that sort of contrary to Telemundo's best interest?
So who here has heard Despacito?
Woo! Despacito.
I know you guys have heard it. There's only a few people. If you guys haven't heard it, you're like not listening to music. So I'll give you another example that's closer to NBC Universal and Telemundo. So who saw La Reina del Sur on Telemundo? A few folks. Who has heard or seen Queen of the South on USA? Some more hands. So La Reina del Sur was one of the super series that Telemundo launched, I think it was like 8 or 9 years ago. It changed the landscape I remember working at Nielsen and being like, wow, this is a completely new format or story for Spanish language television. Now, about 8 years later, it premiered on USA, and it wasn't just a successful show for them with Hispanic consumers. It was the most multicultural premiere or scripted original premiere in the network's history with 18 to 49-year-olds. Because nowadays, 18 to 34-year-olds are about 45% more or less multicultural. USA hadn't really marketed to some of those groups before, and I think what we realized as a company with Queen of the South, but also some of the other priorities that we've launched, is that these audiences don't necessarily, it's not like we just got Hispanics. We got a ton of non-Hispanic whites, and we got a ton of African American and Asian viewers who also saw points of authenticity and relevance in that story. Because guess what? It has a brown a brown woman with, who's on top in that story, which I had never seen on Spanish language TV. And I presume there are probably other backgrounds that haven't sort of seen these kinds of identities represented.
Right.
So I think that that's where some of the universality of the storylines, we're bringing that diversity that just makes it more authentic for viewers.
Right, and let's not forget the success of Narcos on Netflix, which
Right.
is basically them copying you guys. I mean, they are the ones that started the narconovela whole thing, and now, now there's
Right, that's
Narcos.
another great example of how, that super series format has come into the mainstream, not just on USA, but on lots of other places.
Okay. All right, so Joetta, you've got a lot of networks within your sort of all the networks that you have, including, of course, Lifetime. But in general, what do you think about this idea of sort of breaking down boundaries of race, ethnicity, gender?
Well, I look at it more as reminding ourselves that that's not all we are, and that there's a nuance in being human that each of us brings to an experience, and that is, yes, influenced by race and ethnicity. It is influenced by income, education, socioeconomic class, political viewpoint, personality. Like, it is influenced by all of those things, and I think that obviously those kinds of categorizations are necessary because we have to make business decisions. We cannot make decisions based on each individual out there in the world. But I think it is sometimes a little easier to then forget about all the nuance that rests underneath that. And I think we can find more interesting commonalities or implications or contradictions that I think can open up ideas and creativity on how to reach people and what they're looking for and how they're seeing things. And to me, it's not a matter of it not being relevant, it's a matter of it being complicated and nuanced, and actually appreciating that and thinking about what that means as you then necessarily then have to make business decisions, which require not looking at each person as an individual.
Right. So just to be clear, it's not like we're saying forget about race, forget about ethnicity, we don't care about those categories anymore. Just saying that perhaps looking at them exclusively and keeping people in these different silos and not looking at other factors that might either cut across different segments or that might create a more nuanced understanding of those groups within the identity groups, within the groups, is just a really important next step. So why now? Why are we having this conversation today and not, let's say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even 2 years ago? What's changed in your businesses, in the world? I mean, we saw a lot of data from Evan about the media sort of landscape.
I think, Evan was talking a lot about how we need to reimagine our categories. And I think this is one way, technologically we're having to reimagine how we get our stories to consumers. But I think demographically, the demographics have changed. and they continue to change. The 18 to 49 demo over the next 10 years is going to become 45, maybe close to 50% multicultural. And so that just, the young consumers of today are Hispanic and Black and Asian American, and white too, but that's also, that's changing. And then that generational cohort has a different experience with people who are different, or who may be different in some of those silos, but then share certain commonalities in other ways.
Right.
So all of this, I think, is also coupled with a questioning of gender identity, a questioning around, we're also becoming more biracial than we ever have been as a country. So then, and I like to say Hispanics were the original hybrids, because we come from a world where, this already happened hundreds of years ago. But I think that also is sort of leading us to see different stories and different characters represented.
Yeah, and I also think, the fragmentation that, we've been talking about creates opportunities to tell those stories, and it makes the nuance more potentially useful as well. When you have 3 networks and live TV, and, you do need to tell big, unifying stories that strike some commonalities, or, and you don't necessarily have to do that anymore. And so understanding that nuance and when that works is important.
I think now, too, it's getting to the point of getting people to actually finish viewing content. I think because of the fragmented world, and because you're distracted and you have so many other things to do at the same time, it's now, again, reaching people with the right content so that they're actually willing to view it through its entirety, or getting your message out there within, depending on what platform you're on. Could be 3 seconds, it could be 30 minutes. But it's getting the message out there that can speak to everyone at once,
Right.
In a clear way that will get them to want to watch through its entirety.
Right. And I think too that there is, you mentioned this yesterday, Joetta. We can't escape the sort of the overarching political environment. We're not in post-racial America, in case anybody noticed. That hasn't happened yet. We're not in, as you were saying earlier, post-gender America. That has not happened yet. I think the past year and a half or 2 years have kind of brought that very front and center. And so really understanding, so to me, it's all about intersectionality. And for those of you who don't know what that word means, we talked about it yesterday. Intersectionality is actually, it's a social science theory. It was created by a Black feminist, to talk about the sort of intersectional nature of structural inequalities on people, right? So if I'm, white and male, I have significantly fewer structural inequalities that I have to worry about than if I'm Black and female, or if I'm gay, or if I'm low income, and all those others. So racism, sexism, classism, and all those things. But if we take it out of the social science sphere, and theory sphere, and bring it into the marketing sphere, which my sister, the anthropologist, is probably so upset at me for doing, it's basically like a more sophisticated view of how to understand how to segment audiences, right? By sort of the experiences that they have in the world, how they experience the world, and how the world experiences them. And what that means about informing people's worldviews, and therefore the content that they're going to, find relevant to them, and that's going to appeal to them, and advertising and the messaging as well. So that's kind of where the framework where we got yesterday, and I think where we are today. But I guess the challenge is, how do you operationalize that when you are, first of all, operating in a business that's very comfortable with these other silos and this other understanding? Like, how do you do this, whether from a research perspective or even just selling it in to your stakeholders or your clients? Joetta, you want to talk about that?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. I think one thing is that so the work that I talked about yesterday is basically looking at the experience of gender across different women, and different women experience being female differently. It impacts their lives differently. There are certainly commonalities, but there are also differences. Not everyone experiences what it means to be female. Not everyone is interacting with the same societal expectations. And I think that has implications because, and what we looked at in the work, is how do those differences then impact how you react to content, specifically advertising in our case. And the business implication there is that when you put a piece of content, like a 30-second spot or a show, out there in the world, you have an idea of what you think the message is that you're sending. But if you don't really understand who's receiving it and what their framework is and what they are noticing and what structure they're using to digest that, you may be saying something other than you intended. And you may be saying something different to different people. And so, I mean, one of the business implications is, first of all, understanding that and remembering that. And secondly, I mean, we talked about this yesterday, making sure that the people who are putting out that content actually have themselves a variety of frameworks and experiences, because you are more likely to understand the different ways in which the same 15 seconds or hour-long content is going to be read and going to be understood.
Yeah. Can you share that example of the secret ad? Because I thought
sure.
we loved everybody.
So one of the ads that we looked at almost 70 different ads across a bunch of different kinds of research, and one of the ads is in that series of secret ads where they're like flipping the script, stress test moments, I think they're called. And one of the ads we showed to participants in our research was one where a woman is proposing to a man in a restaurant, and he's, his name is in the fortune cookie, and he's all confused about how did his name get in a fortune cookie. And then she's like, shut up here, and holds out a ring and proposes, and it's like she flipped the script. This is the stress test moment. Secrets there for you in those stressful moments. And across our research, one of the things that we saw is the single most differentiating variable, consistently differentiating across all kinds of experiences of gender, was political point of view, actually. And that's actually a proxy for your moral framework. It's not about who you voted for or what party you belong to, but a proxy for how you view the world, how you detect right and wrong. Where does morality actually live for you? And so we saw, and I'm mentioning this first because then we saw something else as well. What we saw there is that the more conservative women viewing this ad saw something that was taking away from them a benefit that they appreciate of the traditional roles. So there are benefits to the traditional female role, and I enjoy those, and you are taking those away from me. And not necessarily, from their point of view, with compensatory gains.
Right.
And then the more liberal viewers are like, thank goodness we're flipping, like, what do these traditions mean anyway? We can do something new. But more markedly noticeable than that was that when we did focus groups, we divided them by age and race and ethnicity. And in the focus groups with the black women...
Well, you didn't mention that the two characters...
I forgot to mention. The characters are both a black woman and a black man. And, thank you, that's a part of the...
little detail.
Yeah, small detail. And the focus groups with the women, the universal reaction across the age groups among these women was just disappointment and frustration. Because I don't have the quote with me now, but it's something like, why do they have to make it a black couple in a dark restaurant? Like, this isn't what the proposal would look like with a white woman.
Right.
Like, they wouldn't have done this. There's a whole series of ads, and women knew, the women knew and liked this series of ads. It's not that they didn't like the idea, and they appreciated the diversity in casting. They were grateful for yes, we should have more representation, but they thought, why couldn't it be the ad where the woman went in and talked herself up in the bathroom about going in and asking for a raise? Why couldn't that be the ad in the series that featured a black woman? Why did it have to be this one where she's proposing to, frankly, this dummy who can't figure out what's going on? It's not a very romantic location. It's, she should have gotten up and left. Right. Why did she propose? That didn't feel right. And that's a cultural context that, frankly, when we chose the ad, it was not our intention to test that at all. We were looking for different representations of women across from more traditional to more progressive. And it's an example of if you come to things with different frameworks and you see different things because of race and ethnicity, because of political point of view, because of education, because of all of those kinds of things.
Exactly. I thought that was really fascinating. I obviously was very into your presentation yesterday, as I was into all the presentations, but that was really cool stuff. So Renny, at Telemundo, you know, and having worked with you on this a lot, Telemundo has this sort of understanding, you'd mentioned it yesterday, the 3Ms, multicultural, millennial, mobile, but really honing in on sort of a more nuanced understanding of the Hispanic television viewer, and we talk about the crisscrossers and the Spanish language television lovers and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that guiding principle has really influenced a lot of the programming decisions, a lot of the marketing decisions that have been made at Telemundo. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's all part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we obviously have a huge commitment that I feel personally as someone who works at Telemundo to our community. And our community continues to grow. We're about 60 million strong now, and you know the census projections every year get, every time the census releases a new round of estimates, they get even more bullish. And so as the community gets bigger, we've seen in a lot of our identity and demographic research that there are new Latino identities emerging within the U.S. Hispanic segment. And we need to be able to speak. Our commitment is to speak to all of those different identities and make sure that they are represented throughout the characters in our stories, which hasn't always been the case in Spanish language media. But again, getting back to the idea of intersectionality, as you represent the story of Celia Cruz, you're not just representing the story of this, you know, global icon and megastar. She also happened to be a woman in a man's world.
Right.
She was, we say Latina or Black Latina in a world that was dominated by white artists. And so all of those things then create different relevance points to that story that make it more universal. And that's sort of an area that we're really leaning into, how all of these different kinds of intersection points reveal authentic stories and struggles within our characters that then make our stories universal.
Right.
Because you don't have to be Latino to watch the story of Celia Cruz. You don't have to be a woman. You don't have to be, you know, you can enjoy this story just because of what it means and what it represents in the history of humanity.
Right.
So those are the things we're leaning into. Music is a huge part of that. I think in culture today, not only with Latinos, but the rise of hip hop in American culture is tied to that as well. And for us also sports. So, you know, we mentioned earlier, I think Evan was talking about how many of the sports franchises are seeing declines. The FIFA World Cup is the youngest major league in the United States today. And, you know, the wave hasn't even crested
Right.
yet. So that's another area that I think young people, who doesn't play soccer, talk about sort of crossing race and gender lines. Everyone, you know, when you think about football, American football, you have quarterbacks and cheerleaders.
Right.
Soccer, anyone around the world can play soccer
Right.
if they have a soccer ball. So.
Right, and in some research we just did around the World Cup, that was one of the interesting sort of learnings, was that when you look at this really core fan base of Latino World Cup fans, and then you look at non-Hispanic younger World Cup fans, the behaviors are very similar. The passion, the level of passion for the sport is similar. The digital behaviors are similar. So I mean, I think there's an opportunity to cut across.
I think another, and maybe something that we can talk about somewhere along the way here, is also the rise of the strong female character in content. So for Telemundo, that has been a cornerstone of our strategy over the last 10 years. And it's really paid dividends because, again, before, all you had were, the poor girl who had to wait 200 episodes to fall in love, or like just to kiss her Prince Charming. Or, you had women falling down the stairs gratuitously. And slaps and lots of cleavage, and so that has changed in the way that we represent our characters. Vicente Acero, Teresa Mendoza, Sara Aguilar. We have so many. Monica Robles. All of our main characters are Latinas on top.
And you saw that too in your research, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of those things that kind of cuts across all of these demographics. Is when we were talking to women in our studies, we asked them about do you see yourself, do you feel that you see yourself represented in media today? And only 6% of the women we spoke to strongly agreed that they do see themselves. So there's that opportunity. And then we said, well, what do you want to see? Like, how should women be represented? And one of the ways we did it is we had women send us in images of how they wanted women to be seen and how they wanted women to be portrayed, and then, you know, a description, and did narrative analysis around it and everything. And the core theme that came through across all of this was they wanted to see representations of strength. They wanted to see strong women, and women were very clear with us that that is not one thing. That is not only being the boss of a company. That is not only, you know, physical strength. That it was actually about a lot of different dimensions of strength and how those play out.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also a matter of, like, the reason that that's important is that women will see themselves in those stories, because one of the pieces of research that we've just wrapped up is going into the homes of 12 different women across the US and just hearing their life stories and seeing their homes and their environments. And as they tell those life stories, those same descriptions of the kinds of strength that the women told us through the narrative analysis and through the images comes through in what they emphasize as key moments in their lives. And so it's that connection of relatability and that idea of, like, oh, you are speaking to me, you do see me as a human, so I'm engaging.
Right.
So
Which
think
I was just going to say.
Yeah, so I
go
think
ahead.
that actually gives, you know, Twitter actually gives that
Yep.
platform to
Yep.
do that and have that conversation.
Talk about Me
When
Too.
Me Too was obviously a huge movement and gave a voice to women who haven't had a voice, you know, for personal issues. And it not only gave them a voice, but it also gave a voice for change. And so it's giving people this platform where they can, again, find these like-minded people or people in similar situations where they wouldn't find that on other platforms because it's your friends or your family. You know, you're finding people across the world or you know, around the globe that are in those same kind of circumstances. Those same kind of things are happening to them as well. And so Twitter gives a great platform or voice for that. And I think now brands are trying to figure out how do they get involved in that conversation without being alienated.
Yeah.
So how do they jump on that bandwagon of being part of these movements without, you know, taking a stance and really having some people not agree with them or, you know, not want to be part of that conversation or be part of that brand anymore. I think, you know, two brands that have done it really well, Dove does a really good job of talking about beauty and body image and really trying to change perceptions around that. And they have had many years focusing campaigns around that. And then also Wendy's. I think Wendy's has done a phenomenal job over the last year of really trying to hone in on personalizing connections with people on Twitter. They have days where they roast people. So people will tweet something to them and then they'll send them like a roast tweet, and they do this all day, and they do that once a week. I think it's like Roast Wednesdays or something like that. But you know, I think that it's creating this connection point that brands are trying to get more personalized, so that it feels less of, you know, trying to overarchingly reach everyone and make that personal connection.
Well, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about sort of the Me Too movement and some of the conversations that I've been seeing is that, you know, one would think that that Me Too is this like sort of universal woman's movement. But then when you start looking a little bit deeper, you start seeing, again, the intersectionality, right? That there are sort of very different experiences that women of color have compared to white women, for example. And that conversation is being had in Twitter and in other social media platforms. I think it's really important and relevant to the rest of this conversation because you know, we can't ignore those nuances anymore, because then if we're creating content, we're creating messaging, we're going to come off as inauthentic and really tone deaf, because the information's out there. You just have to go and search the hashtag.
Well, people are like, they're putting it out there and saying that they're open to talk about it. And so I think that that's a door or a window in for people to actually be part of the conversation. You know, once that they've put it out there and it's become such a global phenomenon or global movement, that it just opens the door and allows you to actually have the conversation.
Right. So I want to get to, I asked this already, but we didn't really talk about it in depth. I mean, this is all great, but how do we operationalize it at the corporate level, right? How do you take this back to the programming people or the ad sales people or your clients, and start sort of getting them to think differently, right? Changing their mindset about how to approach, forget about multicultural audiences, how to approach, this quote unquote general market that is a nothing. It's like the emperor has no clothes. If all of this is true, right? So how do we now operationalize this at our own companies?
I think one of the things that I think we learned from, that we're learning from this ongoing work is that when there are principles, there are basic principles that women are very clearly telling us and telling us through their reactions to advertising and representations of women in advertising. And we're working on a similar study for men and seeing similar kinds of things, that there are principles that everyone can connect with and that everyone can appreciate. So no one is, in the study, we looked across a broad variety of ads, and there's a group of ads that actually did really well and was really appreciated by, regardless of race, ethnicity, political, that did really well and were really appreciated for their representations. And when you look at what those commonalities are, they were all about reflecting reality, and we all know that reality is more diverse and that not everybody is like us, and that and that there are different definitions of what family is and different definitions about what success is and all of those kinds of things. And if that is reflected, in our research at least, the women really appreciated that. And even if it didn't align with their personal views completely, they understood it reflected reality. Right. And so if it reflected reality while not denigrating their position. And right. So, like for instance, different definitions of family. There's a lovely IKEA ad that has a sequence of scenes of families in kitchens, and it's different kinds of families. It's all kinds of different kinds of families. A same-sex couple, a grandmother and a granddaughter, a big traditional sit-down dinner, all kinds of families. And across the board, women said, yeah, that's good. That's what I want to see, because I know not every family is like mine, but this doesn't tell me that that's the only kind of family and your kind of family is bad. It says, look, this reflects reality. And I think there's this, it gets back to that whole, reflect reality, be inspirational rather than aspirational, really speak to what the world is in a way that doesn't hold one thing up as better than another.
Right. That's interesting, because that reminds me of a lot of things that we've heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, multiplicity. I think showing different backgrounds and different experiences of the same issue is huge to not just our entertainment storytelling, but even how Telemundo reports the news to Hispanic America needs to make sure that we're bringing together different voices and different points of view.
Right.
I think it's also making sure that you're aligned with what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Don't try to force something that isn't aligned with your brand or your network, or just make sure that it's natural, because I think if you align with what you believe in as a brand or even as a person, that the consumer base or the eyeballs or whatever you're counting will follow naturally, just because for lack of a better word, authentic. Mm-hmm. It feels more authentic to them and more natural as a person.
I think also if you can give viewers, we've found that a lot of our most successful properties, on the surface, El Señor de los Cielos is about, a narco bootlegger and people, in the marketplace, sometimes the press gives Telemundo some flack for representing that story, especially in today's political climate where Hispanics aren't always getting the right representation. But if you really sit down and you watch El Señor de los Cielos, right. It is in a world where 10 or 15 years ago, and you could argue even today in certain countries in Latin America, the media and the message to people is being controlled. El Señor de los Cielos is an opportunity for our audience to see the history in Mexico reflected through a different point of view that's very relevant to that audience and allows them to sort of stand back and see that. So I think opportunities, Celia, I think is another one that we could talk about, all the ways that it did that. Mm-hmm. If you give viewers opportunities to reflect on that reality and to talk about it and to see it on screen, I think that's going to bring people in, because people are looking for increasingly more of that opportunity to reflect and to discuss.
Plus, he's really hot.
Absolutely,
mean,
that's part of it too. You know, and the gunshots and the action and,
Yeah.
and all of that. But I think people don't always. That's more obvious. It's the broader. You know,
Yeah.
people don't realize how much is being said in El Señor de
Yeah.
los Cielos.
Yeah. So, you know, we talked a little, we've harked back to this whole idea of living in a challenging time for having conversations around race and ethnicity and culture and all that, given the broader political landscape. And I would bet that there are a lot of people that may be in, or companies that last year, whether it's programmers or advertisers, who got a little gun shy about maybe getting in front of this conversation. For fear that, well, wait a second, like, how is this really true? Like, is America as diverse and multicultural and all this multicultural kumbaya, is this really real? Or is what's really real what we're seeing coming out of, you know, Trump's Twitter feeds? Like, what's the reality, and what's the sort of, what is the risk that we would take by sort of taking a stand? What would you all say to folks thinking in those terms, if anything?
I mean, I think when we talk to folks about the work we're doing, we're actually very careful not to say what you should do, because what you should do really depends on what your goals are. It's really more about being aware of the decisions you're making that you might not even realize you're making, and knowing sort of that can have real impact too. Just because you didn't realize you were making that decision, it can also have an impact. And so, you know, I think it's, look, the reality is that each of us do have a framework that is not identical to the person next to us. And that comes from our culture and our experiences and our personality and all of those kinds of things. And, you know, that also is true of the avid followers of Trump's Twitter feed. They are no less human, no less nuanced. And so I think that I think that it's really just a reminder, and an important reminder, that the way I see the world is not the only way the world is seen, and that's the same for all of us. And being aware of that and constantly remembering that in the face of the necessary pressure to rely on demographic categorizations and stereotypes, and like, we cannot get anything done if we have to process everyone as an individual. But remembering that we are taking those cognitive shortcuts, that we are using those things, and not forget that using them doesn't erase the nuance that actually exists underneath. Right. So to me, it's just more about keeping us aware of the decisions of when we are simplifying things and when we are notching out that nuance, and understanding what the potential implications are.
Mm-hmm. Megan, any thoughts?
I agree with that. I think it's just remembering that not everyone has your same point of view. I mean, you have to think about, I think there's having multiple people at the table when you're making decisions, so that you're getting multiple points of view at all times. You know, obviously Twitter's a place where voices are to be heard. So I think it's giving people the platform to give their perspectives and to give everyone, you know, their time at the table in order to get their voices heard.
I agree, very well said. I have nothing to add.
Well, although I would actually add to that. I agree with all of that, but I would add to it that you know, that the multicultural train has left the station, and that is, I mean, the demographic shifts are happening. A lot of what we're seeing is, yes, backlash, because there is fear, and when people see difference and people see, their own sort of realities or culture being challenged or whatever, there might be that backlash. But the fact is that this is, between the media fragmentation that we have, between the demographic shifts that we have, between the power of social media that exists, we have an opportunity to be able to tell more relevant stories, to connect more deeply with consumers and viewers based on a more nuanced and meaningful understanding of who they are and the issues that they face and the commonalities of those experiences, but also, and then the intersectionalities of them as well. And that if you don't do that, you're not going to be prepared for the chaos that is here and is to come. And so,
I think there's also, politics aside,
Right.
thinking about the research that we conduct even as NBC Universal, we need to make sure, I think there's a little bit of like a self-fulfilling prophecy if you aren't designing your research methodologies to make sure that you represent all of those backgrounds and voices.
Oh, yeah.
And so in the Spanish language market, I'm always miffed that there are a lot of studies put out in the industry where Hispanics and Spanish language television viewers or media consumers are sort of left out of the equation. So then, you're never going to hear those different perspectives, and you're not going to be able to serve them as you tackle the imperative of reimagining your category.
Right.
So the multicultural train has left the station. Are we going to get on it, and are we going to do research in a way that represents everyone?
right, which is something we're working on with
Yes.
the ARF. So, excellent. So I think we have a few minutes left. I don't know if it's time for Q&A. All right, well, first of all, thank you all for this great panel. I'm a little confused about, oh, I see.